What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you the Season 2, Episode 10 review of The Walking Dead entitled 18 Miles Out. See the smile? Yeah, I've been waiting on this baby. But before I say anything else, let me say this first. This review will contain spoilers. And I would just want to get that out the way because the way this episode works out with the relationship between the narrative and the sort of, philosophical argument that's being developed based on that narrative, it's extremely difficult for me to review this episode in a way that does not contain spoilers. And I just don't want to be limited by having to constantly, think about, whether I want to include this about the episode or I don't want to include that. So let me just say straight off that if you would prefer to watch the episode before you watch this review, I would recommend that you do that because this review will contain the major spoilers of the episode. So now that I've got that out the way, yeah, yeah, this is the happy face. This Rick versus Shane, baby. Rick versus Shane. Finally, this subplot about the tension between Rick and Shane comes to a head, and wow. Wow. Let me say this though. Although I think that the writing for this episode is definitely 10 out of 10. It's consistently, as well as along with all the other previous episodes, the writing has been consistently superb. Although the end of this episode left me feeling a little bit ambivalent about the way this ends. So, I'm not entirely sure whether or not I like this episode, but the writing was definitely a 10 out of 10. So let me just jump right into it. And so instead of, doing this review the way I usually do it, which is to separate the summary and then the analysis, I'm just going to combine those two segments of the review this time. So that the episode starts off with a bang. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, a bang. So Rick and Shane are being chased by walkers. They're being swarmed by walkers. Basically, they don't have any guns. Although I think Rick does have a gun. I think Rick might have a gun, but Shane definitely doesn't have a gun. And then the injured guy who they captured in the previous episode, he's tied up. They got him tied up with rope, but he's in the midst of them being swarmed by walkers. This guy is trying to crawl towards towards a knife on the ground to find a way to free himself and to defend himself against these walkers. And I saw the preview just like everybody else did, and this episode has, been highly anticipated because of that preview. But this looked like just a straight up zombie invasion, zombie ambush. And so, there's no context provided for how this happens. And we just jump straight into the action. So everything just looks like it's going haywire at this point. And then it cuts to the intro. And so basically what that opening scene was a sort of narrative framing device for the rest of the episode. What they did was they kind of told the story a little bit out of order. And the reason why they probably did that is to increase the suspense for, if you see that, opening, you're more likely to say, okay, I got to watch the rest of the episode so that I can figure out how did they get to this point. So when it comes back out of the intro, then, the show goes back to the beginning of the true beginning of the narrative so that you can see the proper context about how, Shane, Rick, and the injured guy got caught in the middle of this, basically a zombie ambush. So one of the first scenes, and after they come out of that intro was that, their plan is to take the injured guy 18 miles out or 18 miles away from the farm, which is where the title of this episode comes from. And so, Rick and Shane are riding out, they're kind of, preparing for the journey. They're scouting to see, where they could possibly, take this injured guy so that he doesn't find his way back to the farm. And, Rick stops the car and they get out, and then Shane gets out and he's like, I thought we were going 18 miles out. This isn't 18 miles. We haven't hit that yet. And so this is the time that Rick decides to have his, talk with Shane. And so, first of all, before they even start the talk, you can see how, this is gonna end up. At least you have some idea about how this might end. So Shane is holding a shotgun. Shane is holding that shotgun. and Rick is got his hand next to his holster. He's got his hand on his gun, and so basically, what happens, with Shane holding the shotgun and Rick with his hand by his holster, you realize that this is going to be a clash between power and authority. And that's basically what this whole conversation between Rick and Shane was symbolic of. Authority equals, the legitimate monopoly on force. That's what authority is. That's what it means when you give someone the authority to do something. Power, on the other hand, is just the straight up ability to coerce or impose yourself on another person. Now, Rick obviously has, well, I wouldn't even say obviously, right? Because his moral authority is somewhat in question, given what I said in the last episode review. But at least insofar as the other members of the group are concerned, Rick does have the moral authority, and he also has the authority as the leader of the group, someone who the group depends on to make crucial decisions. On the other hand, but what's also interesting about this is that Rick's authority is predicated on a certain amount of power, and that's why you see his hand move over towards that gun when he first starts to talk to Shane, because he realizes authority isn't enough. You might have to use brute force against Shane, and that would prove to be somewhat providential, as we'll see throughout the rest of the episode. But Shane, on the other hand, has very little authority when it comes to the group, especially when it comes to, at least when it comes to, Dale and Lori and perhaps even Rick, because Rick is a little bit mistrustful as well. But he does have a certain amount of power, and that power has to be respected. And that's, again, part of the reason why Rick has to have his hand on the gun when he's talking to Shane. So basically, Rick lays claim to his family, and he says, Lori's mine, Carl's mine, the unborn baby is mine, and basically, you got to back the fuck off, or else things are going to get real hot for you. That was basically the gist of the conversation. And Shane is not really saying anything. He's got his head bowed down, and he understands what's going on. And then Rick starts to question Shane about Otis, and then Rick says, "You don't think I would have done it?" Meaning, you don't think I would have shot Otis in order to escape and save Carl's life. And this is interesting because the implication is obviously that Rick would have shot Otis. And just to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, for those of you who have been claiming that it was unethical for, Shane to shoot Otis, and, Shane only shot Otis because he's a sociopath or a psychopath or whatever, it's very interesting because now here's Rick, who's also saying that in order to protect his wife and in order to protect his son Carl, he would have shot Otis too. At least that's what it seems that he's implying. So, like I said, Rick tells Shane, he says, "You don't think I would have done it?" And then Shane says, "I know you wouldn't have done it." And so obviously the underlying subtext here is that, can Rick, does Rick have what it takes to protect Lori and Carl? And of course, this also gets into another conversation about, ethics versus, the reality of survival. And for those of you who are interested in that discussion, I've done a couple of other not previews, a couple of other reviews about precisely this question about the relationship between ethics and the reality of survival and a zombie apocalypse. So if you're interested in that conversation, you can look back through some of my previous episode reviews. But anyway, Rick says, "I'm not the good guy anymore." And so first he implies that he would have shot Otis in order to protect Lori and protect Carl, and then he straight up tells Shane, "I'm not the good guy anymore." And of course, this is at least partially evidenced by the fact that in that episode, I believe it was Triggerfinger. I believe, was it Triggerfinger? The episode before last. No, Nebraska. That's what it was, Nebraska, where he shot, Dave and Tony. And so, this is letting Shane know, listen, man, my thinking about ethics in these types of situations has been evolving, and I'm not the good guy I used to be. So, you better watch yourself. And obviously, this is the writer's way of laying the foundation for the evolution of Rick's character, which is, doing a very, very good job. So after this conversation, they get back in the car, and they finish scouting. But then later on in the episode, they put the guy in the trunk. I think they put some duct tape over his eyes, and then they put some earphones in his ears and have him listen to music, and tape the earphones in his ears, so he's disoriented, so he doesn't know where he's going, so he won't be able to find his way back to the farm once they release him. So Rick and Shane, put the injured guy in the trunk, and they're driving out. And there's this very interesting conversation that happens between Rick and Shane while they're in the car. This is a lot of very good dialogue in this episode. I must say that. So Rick is talking about preparing for winter, and this is not even a little, but this is very interesting, because I believe they're in Georgia, somewhere in Georgia, in the deep south, where it doesn't snow, and it doesn't have ice. But Rick is telling Shane, if we get some good luck, then maybe we'll have some snow and some ice this winter. And the cold climate has to slow the walkers down. It has to do something to the walkers. It has to have some effect on them. And maybe if we get lucky, we can find some snowmobiles, and we can make preparations for winter, and stockpile our supplies and get some warm clothes. And maybe we should be safer during the winter. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm thinking to myself, come on now, Rick. Come on, man. I understand that you want some optimism, but damn, man, this shit's looking real bad for you guys. But anyway, there's something that quite interesting happens, where there's it cuts to Shane, and Shane is looking out the window while you hear Rick talking in the background. And then the camera cuts to what Shane is looking at, and you see a zombie, a walker, walking past Shane's field of vision while they're driving by. So they're driving by like a field, and out in the field there's just this one single walker who's walking across Shane's field of vision. And this has this has very important symbolic implications for the dynamic between Rick and Shane. Obviously, this sort of intersection between Rick's dialogue and the zombie is perhaps symbolic of, well, not perhaps, I think it actually is symbolic of the way that Rick is not delusional. I wouldn't go so far as to say delusional, but he does seem to be overly optimistic. And this is a very symbolic way of juxtaposing the sort of brutal reality of their situation with the sort of idealism that Rick has. And this is, another facet, or another dimension of, the awesome writing that the writers have continued to show throughout this series. And so it forces you to ask the question, yeah, Rick claims that he would have shot Otis, and he claims he's not the good guy anymore. And perhaps we do have some evidence of that, but still, does he understand what it takes to live in this sort of world? Does he really understand the cost of living in this type of world? And you're not really sure about it. And this zombie that's walking across Shane's field of vision, juxtaposed with Rick's conversation about the winter in the background, forces you to ask these sorts of questions, and sort of puts the Rick's moral authority in question. So they finally get to the place where they want to release him, and they release him. It seems to be at a Department of Works building, something like that. So it's abandoned, and there's some evidence that there were walkers there who were burned, and there's also some walkers that they happen to run into, and they have to kill them. And so they drag the guy out of the trunk, and they just plop him down, take the tape off, take the mask off, and say, well, we've done all we can for you, brother, and it's time to part ways. So they start walking away from him, and obviously this guy's well, he's tied up, and Rick kind of walks like 10 feet away and throws the knife down. He obviously doesn't want to release him before he has the opportunity to walk away from him, because he might try and struggle, put up a fight, whatever. So Shane and Rick are walking away. They're about to go back to the car and, go back to the farm. And this guy's pleading for his life. Please don't leave me here. Please, I'm just a kid. I used to, my mother, became a walker, and, all this other stuff. And finally he says, I used to know Maggie, for God's sakes. Shane and Rick look at each other like what? then he starts talking about how, he went to high school with Maggie and about how he knew her father. And Rick and Shane are like, oh, this might be a problem because now he knows where the farm is. So Shane is about to take him out because Shane is like, listen, man, he knows what the farm is. He could come back with his group of friends and, overrun us, and we got to protect ourselves. So Shane, without any hesitation, Shane is a bad motherfucker. Shane pulls out his gun, aims, and he fires. But right at the point where he fires, Rick kind of, pushes him to the ground. And Rick's like, listen, man, I won't let you just kill him like that. And so Rick clearly understands the gravity of the situation. And he's like, well, let me think about it. We'll take him, we'll put him back in the car, we'll drive back to the farm, and I'll have to take a night to think about it. And then Shane's like, what do you mean? You want to bring him back to the farm? We now understand that he knows who Maggie is. We know that he knows where the farm is. This is the guy who, with the group of other people tried to kill you. We don't know what he'll do if we decide to let him go. And you want to bring him back to the farm where Lori and Carl are? And Shane says, the right decision is the one that keeps us alive. And then Shane says, well, you know what, man? I don't think you can keep Lori and Carl safe. And then Rick, you see, Rick's whole demeanor just changes. And there's like a pause for a second. And then, Rick takes a swing at Shane. And then all hell breaks loose, man. They start fighting. Knees, they throwing punches, they throwing blows. At one point, Shane gets Rick on the ground, and there's a motorcycle nearby. He takes the motorcycle and just slams it on Rick, and they're really trying to kill each other. Then there's a brief pause in the fight where Rick kind of does some damage to Shane, and Shane gets mad, and there's like a wrench nearby, and he picks the wrench up and he throws it, but Rick kind of dodges out of the way a little bit, and the wrench goes through a window in a building, and then all of a sudden you see a walker stand up and sort of start climbing out of the window, and Rick looks up like, what the fuck? Then you see one walker, another walker, another walker. And then the next thing you know, there's a swarm. They just come climbing out of the window. And come to find out, the building in the place that they were going to release this guy in was basically infested with walkers. So now Rick is fighting walkers, shooting them, stabbing them in the head, and anything he can do to try and get away from him. And the injured guy, like I said, he's tied up. So he's trying to free himself. He's trying to get to the knife. And at one point, he gets to a knife just as a walker gets to him. And he has to stab the walker in the head. And then Shane gets cornered inside of, one of those, yellow school buses. And it's not looking too good, man. Shane has a knife. And, he's trying to keep the walkers out of the bus, so he's got his back pressed up against the door, and he can't keep it all the way closed, and he kind of cuts himself and smears some blood on the door, so that when the walkers come and try and get at the blood, he can just stab him in the head that way. But basically what happens is he stabs a walker in the head, but his knife gets lodged in her head, and he loses the knife. And then the next thing you see Rick and the other injured guy. They see Shane cornered inside the bus, and then there's a brief moment of tension where they pause, and then Rick just leaves Shane on the bus, and I'm like, damn. The look on Shane's face was priceless. He was. Oh my gosh, the look on Shane's face was just priceless, man. And Shane just pauses for a second, you really gonna leave me? But yeah, man, Rick just leaves Shane on the bus, and I had to, pause it for a second, damn, Rick is grimy, man. He's gonna really leave Shane. But then, Rick, goes and gets the car. He comes back, and Shane is able to escape, and basically Rick comes back and saves Carl. So now let me sort of discuss, the sort of underlying ethical and sort of psychological complexities of this scene, and the sort of tension between Rick and Shane, and how that comes to a resolution at the end of the episode. And like I said, I feel a little bit ambivalent towards the way this episode ended, but the writing of this episode continues to be absolutely superb. Honestly, I think Rick probably should have left Shane. I mean, this is a guy who you just engaged in a fight with. Your wife tells you that he's dangerous, although, like I said before, that's a lie. And he's kind of asserting his authority, and he's trying to not his authority but his power. And he just tried to kill you when you had a fight with him, with that wrench. And I think Rick probably should have just left Shane there. And he had good reason to leave Shane there. He had every reason to leave Shane there. Although Rick did swing at Shane first, and especially since Shane was about to kill that injured guy with no sort of hesitation. But like I said, of course, Rick saves him. But Rick has really evolved as a character. Because even though he understands that he has good reason to just leave Shane on the bus, he also understands that Rick is sort of like a brother to him, and he loves not Rick, Shane is really like a brother to him, and he loves Shane, and he doesn't want to see Shane go down like that. And at when this is all over, Rick and Shane, this is after Rick has saved Shane from being trapped on the bus. They have this they have another conversation where Rick tells him Lori is mine, Carl's mine, the unborn baby is mine. But this sort of really solidifies the evolution of Rick's character. This sort of conversation that he has with Shane at the end of the episode. Um, Rick tells Shane, we're probably going to have to kill the boy. I mean, he comes right out and tells Shane that we probably can't leave him alive, and we're probably going to have to kill him. But he also says it can't be that easy to kill a person. You can't get to the point where you go into sort of survival mode, and without any hesitation and without thinking of any other possibility, you just shoot a guy because he could possibly kill you when there may be another possibility of saving his life. And basically, we get to a full understanding of the sort of evolution of Rick's character. He understands that in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, you're gonna have to do some things that are gonna challenge your conception of ethics. But you can't get to the point where you allow your humanity to be completely deformed by being in a situation, like a zombie apocalypse. And now he seems to understand, his acknowledgement to Shane that he's probably going to have to kill the boy. It seems to me to suggest that he's now gotten to a point where he acknowledges that again, like I said before, Rick understands that part of his conception of what it means to be a human is to be committed to a conception of ethics that allows you to save everyone's life. And this is where his hero complex comes in. But in this episode, we clearly see that his hero complex has really been shed, because like I said, he understands that he'll probably have to kill the kid now. He'll probably have to kill the boy. And what Rick says to Shane is, he says, you have to trust me. And he's basically drawing on all the experiences, even before the zombie apocalypse, that he's had with Shane, and the sort of love that they've developed between each other like brothers, and the sort of trust that is a natural result of that love, that's been forged, that trust that's been forged by both love and the trauma of the situation in which they now find themselves. And basically what what Rick says when he tells, Shane that he has to trust him and that he has to trust his judgment as the leader of the group is if we allow ourselves to become like Shane, and if we give ourselves over to the idea that we have to kill anybody who gets in our way, and anybody who even, represents a minute threat to our survival, then you basically give yourself up to a world that doesn't have any love, that doesn't have any trust, and doesn't have any redeeming, possibilities for the value of one's own humanity. And now we see that Rick is trying to juggle, this survival mode of Shane with his commitment to, his conception of humanity based on a particular conception of, ethics. And this sort of, not sort of, this really adds depth, a layer of depth and a layer of complexity to Rick's character. And this is just a testament again to the absolutely great writing of the people who are, in charge of, producing and directing and, writing this Walking Dead series. And now we get to see that Rick is, not a static, one-dimensional character who's delusional or who's, completely committed to one conception of ethics. We get to see, the full complexity and the full evolution of, psychological and ethical evolution of Rick's character. And so this episode was just, really good, really just, absolutely awesome episode. And then, Rick, as a symbol to symbolize that he trusts Shane, he, hands Shane a gun. And, this is, again, very symbolic because, he's trying to reestablish that brotherly love and that trust between them so that, the group doesn't basically, fall apart. And so after this conversation, they've, put the injured kid back into the trunk of the car, and Rick and Shane are driving back to the farm. And Shane, again, they're riding back to the farm, and Shane sees the same walker. And this is just, again, another testament to the writing of the people who are in charge of the show. Shane and Rick, are driving back to the farm, like I said, and then Shane sees the same zombie again walking across his field of vision. And now we get to see that the walker, still has a certain symbolic importance, but the symbolism has changed. This time it's the symbolism is of, a sort of resolution between the brutal reality of their situation and the possibility for a different kind of life that is not solely based on this sort of, myopic survival mode that Shane has been engaging in. And so the possibilities for a resolution between these two seemingly opposite worldviews is now, there's now a possibility for the resolution of those worldviews. Very quickly, also there was a sort of, subplot between Lori and Andrea that was, based on the younger daughter of Herschel wanting to commit suicide. And I'll just say, I won't delve into that as deeply as I just delved into this, but I'll just say that, Lori's status as a nutcase has now been solidified. She is a fucking nut. A fucking nut, and she is just incredibly selfish. But like I said, I won't really delve into that. If I decide to delve into this aspect of the episode, I'll probably have to release a part two of this review, or another video about my thoughts on that subplot. And so yeah, this episode was awesome. 10 out of 10 writing. I'm not sure, like I said before, I'm sort of ambivalent about the way the writers have decided to resolve this sort of tension between Shane and Rick. And I'm not exactly sure if I like it, but I think that, depending on how the rest of this season pans out will determine, whether or not I think that's plausible from a narrative standpoint, the way they've resolved this sort of conflict in the worldviews between Rick and Shane. But like I said before, 10 out of 10 episode, great action, great horror, great psychology, ethics, philosophy. Awesome show all around, and I just can't wait for the next episode, because there's also, I'm not going to talk about this, I'm not going to spoil this, but there's perhaps maybe a very interesting development that's about to be revealed within the next couple of episodes. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.